Welcome, everybody. Welcome also online. This is the first webinar organized by TU Delft, The Hague, the first of this year. And we want to have a cycle once per month. It will be a hybrid webinar, so welcome to the offline audience and also welcome to the online audience. My name is Heiko van der Voort. I'm a member of the team TU Delft, The Hague here, and I'm the host today this hour. However, I'm not the main speaker. The main speaker is Mark Bressers. He is from the Dutch Emission Authority. I'd like to summarize is where the Paris agreements become real. Yes. Hope that's okay to you. In fact, what they do, they are the main regulator on the emission trade system, and they're also licensing, have a licensing regime on these emissions. They also enforce regulations on biofuels. So it's a really broad array of tasks, regulatory tasks, all for the sustainability goals as been established in the Paris agreements. Mark will talk to you for approximately half an hour. After this, I reappear and we'll have a Q&A, and so you're invited online and offline to ask him the questions you want to ask. And let's make that then a full hour. So Mark, welcome.
Thanks a lot for your introduction. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. As you might be aware, most of the people working within the national government have been working from their homes over the last 2 years, nearly 2 years, especially the last 2 weeks. So it's great to be out here. It's got to feel like I'm in kindergarten in a way. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Mark Bressers. I'm director of the Dutch Emissions Authority, and I'd like to tell you something about, well, not only what we do, but in general, the role of market system and pricing in delivering answers to all kinds of societal challenges. I studied public administration myself, and of course, it's a very interesting question, and I suppose for you too, being primarily students, engineering and public analysis, isn't it? Most of you, I suppose. So I can imagine you're working on and thinking about, well, we've all kind of this global challenges, what the ideal policy mix to deal with it. So I hope to, well, share you some of my experiences and the way pricing can be part of an ideal policy mix. And I have to do it in 30 minutes, so I have to speed up the process. And of course, well, being you the chair, if I talk too much, maybe you have to give me some secret signal or anything. I'll just say stop, and I know enough. Yeah, come in, please do. Thank you very much. We're situated in The Hague too, like you guys. This is our office. Maybe some people of you know it. It's at the Koningskade, behind the province house. And it's not all part of the National Emissions Authority. We just rent one part of it. We work with about 80, 90 people on what we do. But maybe in the near future, when we have interns like you at our place, I can really think it's a great place. We have great views. You can also see the sea. So, well, we have 30 minutes, so I don't want to elaborate too much on it, but really great place to work. Then what we do, like you said, we have in general 3 tasks. I think what most people know us of is we are responsible for the oversight and the implementation of the European ETS, the European trading scheme in Europe, whereas every big company has to pay for all the carbon emissions they have. I will talk to that later on, and I think most of the emphasis on my presentation will be on the EU ETS. What we also do, we have in the Netherlands another market system for delivering more renewable energy in traffic, in all the cars, all the road transport we have here in the Netherlands. And there's a similar like a market system, and we're responsible for that too. And last, we are responsible for the oversight on biomass for electricity. It's not our biggest task, but it's the most political task in a way. As you might be well aware, there's a lot of discussion on the role of biomass in the energy mix. Is it sustainable or not? Sometimes it looks like a discussion on vaccination or not. There are a lot of strong opinions on that. We are trying to be the independent authority on saying when is a biomass sustainable or not. Quite challenging. That is what we do. Well, then I'll skip to why do we do this? And of course, I'm sure you'll be well aware there's a lot of debate and a lot of publicity, for instance, has been over the last week on the COP in Glasgow. But this is at stake, of course. We're facing a big crisis. It's the climate crisis. For the first time, most politicians also call it a crisis. And last year or last summer, we saw in the Netherlands the first real physical signs of this climate change with all the floodings in the south of Limburg. And I think not only this, but the whole climate on talking about climate change has shifted in a way. You could argue some years ago, there were a lot of people in saying, well, of course, there is some change in the climate, but well, is it affected by, or is it because of man-made emissions? That is not the case anymore. That there's really question about it. So when you go to the COP in Glasgow, I think the communist opinion is that there is a climate crisis. Some things need to be done, of course, but the big question, of course, is who is doing what share? How do we pay for it? And of course, a big debate is to what extent are we in the West European countries, or in general in the West, responsible for the solutions to the country, the development countries who really have another opinion on that, of course. So this is the issue, and well, the urgency, you could say, is really reflected in this projection. Maybe you could do, it's the climate action tracker. You can view it on the internet, of course. It's updated every month or every few months. And well, we won't go into too much detail on it, but in a way, maybe for you as students, it's interesting to see the discrepancy between implementation and plans. And what this sees is, well, of course, this is the Paris goal. You mentioned Paris, and in Paris, all the leaders of the countries in the world have said we really have to maximize the warming of the atmosphere to 1.5 degrees, preferably. What it exactly means is, if we want to reach that goal in the next century, we have to decrease our emissions. So we mustn't only lower the growth of emissions, we really have to capture emissions. So this is really a very ambitious task. And what you also see, of course, is that this is the goal, of course, 1.5% warming of the atmosphere. But for instance, all the current policies and actions, they come to about 2.5 till 3 gradients warming of the atmosphere. And of course, well, this is the ambition gap. We talk about 230. You always hear that goal. In Europe, we want to lower the emissions in 2030, 55% compared to the emissions in 1990. And well, what you see here is there's still a big gap between what our plans are and what the actual implementation is with what we now know. Right. Then I'd like to talk to you about what can we do, and just a question to you, because this societal challenge, this global challenge is really immense, and we all have to think about what is the ideal policy mix in dealing with this challenge. And well, this is not a joke, but one other challenge we have, of course, is the endemic of obese. And it's well, maybe a challenge which also reflects the question of what is the ideal policy mix. And maybe you've heard of it, what the Ministry of Health have been doing, I've been thinking. But well, just a question to you, what as you as students, you're thinking about what's the policy mix when you have the task, for instance, you work with the Ministry of Health and the minister comes to you and said, we need this global plan, this global action plan in diminishing the amount of people being obese. What kind of instruments would you propose? So anyone has an idea? Or just shout out if you like. Of course, the people at the other side of the internet. Oh, okay, you.
A sugar tax?
Sugar tax, interesting. So it's a way of pricing, you could say, sugar tax. Anyone else? Yeah?
Information campaign?
Information campaigns, correct? Yeah, yeah.
Maybe something more behavioral, like nudges.
Nudges, yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Interesting. Other things, so pricing, nudges, advertisement, communication. Yeah.
Primary schools.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, in a way, I think you taught them well, by the way, I must say, because in practice, this is an ideal policy mix for any. I talk about the Green Deal later on, but you see with all kinds of societal challenges, this has helped me as a model in attacking societal challenges. You can think about pricing. So pricing bad behavior or pricing good behavior, that can be a case too. That can help. And of course, I will elaborate this later on in my presentation, how we price bad behavior in terms of bad behaviors towards the climate. But it's very important to see that this task is so immense, you need more instruments. And you can also think about targets. So for instance, what you were saying, a fat tax, that's pricing. You have a tax. What you also can do is go to the industry and say, we want you to lower the amount of fat or the amount of salt in the food mix. Then you go with a target. Another thing is rules and regulation. That can be the case when you say, well, there are some technical issues. We want food to comprise of these and these components, or we want cars on the road to be built on this and this technology. It could be a rule. And of course, like you taught in the back, support and standards. That's what we always do too. Support in a way is communicate, is subsidies. And it's not to say that for every societal challenges, you need all four policies. But what we see, and that's my link to the European Green Deal, that is this. All four policy mix or all four instruments are involved. And I think that's a good thing because the challenge is so great, the challenge is so ambitious that we need this mix. Fit for 55, that's the answer of the European Commission towards this goal, the net zero target in 2050 and lowering the emissions in 2030. Before the summer, they delivered this ambitious plan. And it's a plan for climate, for transport, with all kinds of regulation, for taxation, energy. I will discuss primarily the market system and the pricing. But if you look at this package, and I think it's very interesting to well, as students as you are, learning from it. Part of it, it's in pricing. So you see in this package the revision of the existing ETS and new ETS for building and road transport. So what they're saying is we have this ETS, this emissions trading system for the industry, and we will broaden it towards road transport and buildings. So then you take this price instrument. What they also do is, for instance, a revision of the energy efficiency directive. What is the energy efficiency directive is saying? Well, of course, we have to lower our emissions, but it's even better to lower our hunger for energy. So this directive is make it obligatory for companies to have some well, energy cutting investments in their organization, and they can't choose, they have to do that. So for instance, in the Netherlands, we also have this arrangement is when you are able to have investments in energy savings, which will have a cost kickback within 5 years, you are obliged to take this measure. And what this revision does is sharpening that approach. And this is not a pricing, but you could say this is a target. What Fit for 55 also does, for instance, what's very interesting is the revision of the carbon emission standards for cars and vans. So also we not only price emissions, we not only regulate emissions, but what the Commission will be doing is saying, as of 2030, motors within vehicles are not allowed to make use of diesel and benzene. And upward to 2030, there are strong regulations and strong guidances to what amount of carbon or what amount of graphite and all kinds of dangerous stuff needs to go out of this engine. So this is a layering of all the policy mix, and on top of it, it's what I did here is, of course, when you are going to tax emissions, the European Commission and also the member states will, in a way, earn a lot of money, and there are projections of being in billions. And of course, the big question is, how do we help people? And that's the big political question now. We talk sometimes about the digital divide, but it's the sustainability divide. How do we overcome a situation that the poor people living in badly isolated houses will pay, in the end, will pay the most for this energy transition we have to face, we all have to face. So there's a lot of political debate on how can we gather all these taxes, and how can we, in a way, give it back to the people who are part of this energy transition going. And that's also a discussion about the divide between the West and Eastern European countries. Poland will say, well, we come from further, and what are you doing? All kinds of Brussels Democrats. We need more money. The Netherlands is also always saying, well, we don't want to have too much money at stake at European budget. So that's a big political debate, will be going on for the next years, and how not only what do we do, but how do we share the burden, and how do we, the revenues, where will the revenues go? And of course, as you might be aware, when it's about money, it can give a lot of debate. So this is some more, you could say, the frame in which the European Commission has decided to tackle the European Green Deal, to reach the goals. And I won't go into too much detail on all the parts, but it's a mixture of pricing, it's a mixture of targeting, it's a mixture of regulation, and a mixture of support and standards. But even then, the heavy lifting will be done by the EU ETS, the European Emission Trading System. And I'd like to tell you something about that too. Is somebody already really familiar with EU ETS, or is it just something you heard of? You heard about pricing, carbon allowances. Okay, then that's a good thing. Then I'm not here for nothing. First of all, when you look at all the emissions in Europe, this is not only Netherlands, but all the emissions in Europe, about half of it is dealt with what we call the effort sharing regulation. Every member state has to create a package of measures, instruments to lower, for instance, emissions in the agriculture industry, in the housing, in traffic. The other half is, and it's growing, is within what we call stationary, the industry. And the EU ETS, it's good to know, first is dealing with this industrial emissions. And industrial emissions can be Tata Steel, it can be big factories, it can be a data center, for instance. Not because of the energy they buy because in that case, the power station will be part of the ATS, but a lot of data centers, for instance, have their backup supply. That's a big aggregate, and those big aggregates can also have a lot of emissions. So therefore, data centers, for instance, are in the EU ATS. So for Netherlands, for instance, we have about 400 big companies who are part of the EU ATS, and they represent roughly half of the emissions in the Netherlands, and that's about the same, well, the same relation as in other European member states. And altogether, there are 11,000 companies now in Europe dealing with this ATS. Well, what is ATS? It's a cap and trade system. So the first thing we did is saying, and that's this image, every company who has carbon emissions, they need to have an allowance for every ton of emissions they have. So suppose you're a company, you have 100,000 tons of emission in a year, you need 100,000 allowances. Okay, that's simple. Then you could ask, well, how many allowances are there? And the amount of allowances is limited. That's the cap. So the European Commission, in a way, allocates every year a certain amount of allowances. And every year, these allowances are getting less and less. This is a situation before the Fit for 55 package, and there was a diminishing of the amount of allowances of 2.2% a year. And when the Fit for 55 package will be, well, when it is accepted, and it will be accepted because we have signed for the Paris Agreement and we have signed for Glasgow, the amount of reduction will be 4.4%. So it will go more steep. So you can imagine it's limited, the amount of allowances, and it gets more and more limited every year. Yeah, you can imagine when something is limited, when there's a shortage, the price will gain. There will be higher prices in the next year. I'll talk to you about that later. So that's the first of all, it's cap and trade. First of all, there's a cap, that's the amount of allowances. And second, when you are private businesses and you want to emit, how do you get your allowances? And there are a few ways. Half of the allowances are sold on auctions. So we, for instance, as a national authority, every few weeks there is an auctioning, and private businesses can buy all those kinds of allowances. Second, we have, I believe there was a student on carbon leakage here in the room. I don't know, or you, Denham, you were told me.
He's actually online following the lecture.
He's following. Well, carbon leakage, that's another thing. When this system started, there was, of course, you can imagine, a question of well, level playing field. How do we, as a European continent, are we still attractive for businesses when we create this system? Because of the systems, you can imagine products will be more expensive because you have to pay for your emissions. And when you produce steel, or you produce aluminium, or you produce food in other countries in the world where there is no ATS system, then you don't have this disadvantage in a way. So what we did invent is saying, well, when you're a company who is dealing in a global market, you can have part of your allowances for free in a way. So there are kind of complicated calculations to make, but a part of your allowances, roughly less than half of it, you can obtain that through this free allocation. So those are the two ways, and then, well, then it starts. Suppose you're a company, for instance, a company with insufficient allowances. I suppose you are aluminium factory here in the Netherlands. You have a factory with, for instance, is 20 years old. It's not really top of the bill in terms of current technology, and your system isn't that efficient, and you have less allowances through this free allocation, then you have emissions. Then in the end of the year, you're saying to me, well, Mark, I have 100,000 emissions and I only have 90,000 allowances. Then you have a problem because you have to surrender with us 100,000 allowances. Well, you can do two things. You can buy allowances on the auction, but what can also happen is that you're saying, well, for instance, there's another company. It can be a company or a business industry here in the Netherlands, or maybe a paper factory somewhere in Greece, who has some very smart way of making paper, and therefore they need less allowances than they have. In that case, this factory has more allowances on the table, and they can sell you these allowances. Does this make sense? So you suppose this company, they can buy allowances on the auction, or they can buy allowances from a company with lower carbon emissions than they have on their private bill. You could also have this question, well, why make it that complicated? And the idea is there's something to do with this marginal abatement curve. What we need in this energy transition, what policymaker thought is a right thing, is to make a system where we are lowering carbon emissions for less cost. The cheapest way is the best way in a way, because it doesn't matter where carbon and how carbon is injected in the atmosphere. It's all the carbon is the same effect on greenhouse effects. So you could argue, if you want to make this a very rational system, let's have a system where the next carbon emission reduction is the cheapest way of carbon emission reduction. So therefore, these systems give a liberty to a company to ask themselves, well, how do I shorten my emissions? Do I do it by investing in my own company? And maybe that's very expensive because you don't have a budget, you don't have access to the financial market. And suppose there are other companies who can have the same reduction for less money. And in this way, there's a process and there's a way of using the emission allowances of this company who has less money involved in dealing with these emission reductions. And this, for instance, we call this marginal abatement curve. In a way, it's a way of making clear how does the next invention for reduction of carbon cost. And this is made a few years ago for the Netherlands, and here you can see, for instance, at CCS, that's the underground caption of carbon. Well, it's less expensive than, for instance, some other solutions, and of course, other solutions. Those are here. There are even less expensive. So the fact that not all investments in carbon reductions have the same price, and given the fact that all companies are different and face some other challenges, this system for not only having a tax on emissions, but also make it a transferable asset, gives liberty and flexibility to the market. Well, then again, you could argue, well, that's a very complicated elaboration, but will it work? Well, that is what we see now. This is the price of ETS allowances over the last 7 years. And you can imagine about 7 years ago, if you had to have an emission allowance, you had to buy, for instance, it was here, €6. So every ton of carbon you injected in the atmosphere, it would cost you €6. So every company makes their own business case and saying, well, do I want to pay €6 or do I have to lower this emission? And is it worth for me €6 per ton? Well, a lot of investments will be more expensive than €6 a ton. So this company will not do this investment, and they will buy the allowances on the public market. But what we see now, and that's quite interesting, is, of course, here we have February 2020, March. This was the start of the Corona crisis. we're all really interested to see, well, will the price, because over the last year, the price got quite steep up. We thought, well, what will happen now? How will the price drop down? Well, it did not. Just for 1 month, and after that, it really went sky high, like Bitcoins in a way. We think that is because people are expecting the European Commission to sharpening this ETS. When you know that in the next future there will be less allowances, well, all kinds of people in the marketplace, banking, people who speculate on the price, they will put in positions, they will buy more allowances to have them on a banking account for the next year, for the future. So therefore, the price of allowances is growing. Well, is that good? Is that bad? In a way, you could say this has no influence on the cap. And the way we steer on carbon emissions is by lowering the cap. The cap, that means how many emissions will go into the atmosphere. But on the other hand, being on this high price platform, it is for companies now much earlier. There's a good business case in dealing with investments in your carbon emissions. If you make the business case here and you have this aluminium factory, you could argue, well, a new electricity oven or new filters, well, will it cost me or will it help me in lowering the emissions for €6 a ton? Well, it will not. Okay, I will not do this investment. Now you ask yourself, it's about 60, 70 euro now. Much earlier, you have this business case. So in this way, a high price will really trigger innovation and will really trigger investment in lowering your carbon emissions. That's what we see too. From the start of the EU ETS, the carbon emissions in this field, so not all the emissions in Europe, but the emissions, I told you, half of the emissions who are dealing with this EU ETS, they have been lowered with 44%. And in a way, that's quite good. So I always tell this diagram because, well, sometimes you would guess we won't be able to deal with this challenge. It's too much. In a way, this makes clear that lowering your emissions is possible in Europe for countries, for companies who are still being profitable, who have a good competition on a global scale with a global market. So in a way, it's a good sign. Now to give you an idea, this is really the European champion emissions. It's a power station in Poland. You see here some are in Germany. Well, they have emissions of around, well, this is 30 megaton. That's really a lot. For in the Netherlands, all businesses in Netherlands themselves have together 80 megaton of emissions. So you can imagine this is really a big power station. This is in Netherlands, and that's interesting to see because I told you in Europe, the emissions have lowered 44%, but in the Netherlands, just 5%. That doesn't need to be bad because it's a European system. And what we want is on a European level, we want the emissions to lower. And if it's a rational, economic, valid alternative for businesses to not lower your emissions here in the Netherlands, but buy the allowances of a company in France or whatever, then that can be a good case too. But I always see that it gets a lot of questions because you could argue, well, we are not doing a good thing in the Netherlands, but well, it can be a rational choice to do it in this way. Well, these are some of the more famous, the biggest emitters here in the Netherlands. We all know, of course, Tata Steel, Gemmelot. These are not the power stations. So I have another separate scheme for it if you like, but these are the ETS businesses in the Netherlands, the industry businesses. Right. I look at my watch and it's nearly 30 minutes. Well, I'll skip these slides. Maybe 2 slides, if you like, more the abbreviation of the European package. So what does Europe do now? And like I told you, you could say that pricing as part of this policy mix will do the heavy lifting in delivering this European Green Deal. There's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of support, there's a lot of target setting, but in a way, pricing will do the heavy lifting. It will be sharpening for the existing ATS, and like I told you, the cap will be shortened in a much faster tempo as now. But also it will be broadened to building, road transport. There will be a separate system for, the current ETS will be broadened to maritime. So also, ships who are going to Europe and leaving from Europe will have to deal with this ATS too. They have to surrender allowances. Will be a separate system for buildings and road transport. We will have this carbon border adjustment. That's a funny thing. You could argue, of course, well, in lowering our European ambitions, the price of European products will become more expensive, in theory at least. And what is one of the plans is to be able to have a level playing field. When you import products from outside European zone, you'll have to pay a carbon border adjustment. So it will be concrete for aluminium and steel, for instance. When you go to, for instance, with your ship from Korea to Rotterdam, you have to pay for the carbon which you have emitted in producing this steel in Korea. Very complicated, and we'll have to see how to deal with it, but it's a way of, well, creating a level playing field and have the advantage of our own ambitious ETS, but not have the disadvantage of a bad situation in dealing with all countries and lowering our competency. Then my last, I thought, well, you're all students and maybe you're interested to know, well, what kinds of research questions there are. I still have a lot of questions for the next years because it's a very challenging time. And of course, I'm very happy to be director of the Emissions Authority in a time where there are a lot of more ambitious plans from the European Union. We will be broadening our ETS. It's very challenging, it's very complex, but just a few liners as my conclusion. Of course, when we talk about this ETS, we talk about decarbonisation as well, one of the most important proxies, as you will, for having a sane climate here in Europe and in the world. Another question, of course, is how do we deal with biodiversity, circularity, renewable energy? And there can be some complex correlations. And you could argue there are some ways of decarbonisation which will not reflect in renewable energy. You could argue that there are some solutions for decarbonisation who are not necessarily lead to more biodiversity. So the question is also, when we do the heavy lifting by having pricing of carbon, how do we deal with all these kinds of public values? I think what's important, of course, as a national authority for market system, we really like pricing, but it's very good to know there needs to be a very good policy mix. And regulation, for instance, regulation of the engines in cars, target setting will be a very important part of this policy mix. And of course, the question will be, how will they correlate and what is the good correlation between those? I think what's very important is, and that's what, of course, Timmermans is also saying, let's be the world champion in being this very ambitious continent in the world and having the most ambitious climate policy. And what he is saying too, and what we hope to be, is when we are the first, we have a first mover advantage. So our businesses will learn first, will innovate first. But the question is, of course, is will that happen and how will it spark innovation? Very interested to see. And I think more, I'd like to mention it, of course, there's a big relation with the infrastructure. We can't say the industry needs to lower their carbon emission, it needs to electrify, but there's a responsibility for private businesses, but also responsibility for public administrations to deliver the infrastructure, because infrastructure is often, of course, a public a public value. So we need to deal with that. And of course, well, it's a general thing. I don't know whether it's part of your thesis or your curriculum, but we had a lot of debate, of course, in the Netherlands about execution. And we make all kinds of policies here in the Netherlands, but we see it with the Belastingdienst, we see it with UWV. How do we execute all these ambitious plans? And well, you could argue, if you see what the amount of regulation is for businesses, but also for administrations, how do we deal with it? Is it, is it executable? And well, I think that will be a thing we have to make clear in the next coming years. That was it.
I'd like to proceed with this final one because you're the Dutch Emission Authority, so you're also partly executing. This is a plea for the system itself.
Yes.
What is one major execution issue from your perspective?
The execution issue.
What is executability issue?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot, but for instance, the Netherlands, we are importing and exporting country, the harbor of Rotterdam. And one part of this scheme is how do we deal with biorenewable fuels? Yeah. They're coming in Rotterdam and they're going all over Europe. And what this system asks is, well, we need to be sure that certain renewable energy goes to aviation. And we have some system for that. And other renewable energy will go to, for instance, road transport. What we know as an oversight body and as an executioner, that it's very hard to make a distinction between those end users. And in the end, it's the same trucks, it's the same transport schemes. So in a way, the legislation is making this distinction between all kinds of areas, but in practice, it all goes mingling together. And that makes it very challenging as an executioner to deal with all kinds of legislative systems in the world where everything comes together.
These categorization issues and those
exactly
also interest behind each category and how to define it. So. Okay, that's up to the audience to ask some question. I've seen that you already wanted to ask a question. Let's be the first.
Thank you for the presentation. Can you tell me to what extent that, like you mentioned, these plans, like these policy initiatives, the extension of the ETS framework, to what extent is the current form certain to like pass through like the legislature and like actually be implemented? Or is it, for example, certain that it's going to be extended to the maritime industry? And if so, like in it, like as we think right now, or are there going to be political concessions that gonna like change its shape?
Yeah.
Can I please ask you to repeat the question so for the online audience?
If I correct you, I understand you correctly. Question: how certain can we be? There's all these ambitious plans of the European Commission will come into practice. Of course, there will still be a political debate. These are the plans which are publicized in June of this year, and there will be a lot of political negotiation. But on the other hand, we have to deal with the same aims. The European Commission has signed for the Paris treatment and the Paris agreement in saying we have to deliver 50% and the COP 55% of carbon emission reduction. So when you say we are not going to extend the ETS to maritime, well, then road transport has to do more. And if road transport says we won't do that, then industry has to do more. And the industry will be telling, yeah, we'll already do enough because we have had this ETS for 15 years. So, well, I don't know how it ends, but in a system where everybody is pointing to one another, in the end, I think a lot of these plans will come into practice because there's no alternative.
You showed that the price of carbon allowances has greatly increased over the last year. Have you seen interesting behavior because of this? For example, people hoarding or saving these allowances for later on because they might become even more valuable in the future? Or is there any behavior that you saw because of the steep price increase that you maybe didn't expect?
Yeah. Well, this is what is happening. And to be honest, we have two kinds of businesses who can buy allowances and save allowances. Those are the industry companies themselves. So Shell or Tata Steel, they can buy allowances on the market and save them on an account, and it's account at our organization. So we create this account and we maintain this account. But we also have banks, for instance, investment companies. They can be a voluntarily user of this scheme, and they can buy allowances too. And that is what is happening now. Not only last year, it has been happening over the last 15 years. And it was a deliberate aim of this system to also invite other businesses to buy allowances. And for instance, big companies, they can do it themselves. For instance, Tata Steel, they will have a part of the organization who is buying these allowances and storing them. But we also have some more small companies, and they can buy futures. For instance, they can go to this private bank and saying, I need over 1.5 years that many allowances, and if I want to make a reservation, as you will, for these kinds of, how much do I pay now? So they buy futures.
Then the system is also in the advantage of the bigger companies that have capital to buy these allowances, and the others, they need intermediary organizations like banks. Is that true? Or?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. So you could in the end ask, what we do, we are an oversight body for this market scheme, and a market to prosper is a market with lower boundaries, where every part has the same information, where it's easy to enter the market and go out of the market. And we hope maybe that is still the case. But I think we have to be very well aware that maybe it's not, that this situation will not arise. That there are, for instance, some rich oil sheikh from Kuwait is going in and, well, I'll buy the allowances for the next 10 years. And in that way, well, then he has to be so rich. That's not the case anymore. But, well, it's a thing we look at, and the European Commission is looking at. And I think we must be aware of this risk. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite clear that there are promising results from using price in European markets. But given that many developing countries cutting down emissions is still a really big issue, targets aren't really met.
Yeah.
Would you say this model of using pricing as a policy tool, would that be applicable or useful in developing countries as well, where emissions are maybe more closely related to economic growth and so on?
I would guess so, because, well, they can start with their own separate system, of course, and that's what we're seeing now. This is an organization, we're part of it, ICAP, the International Carbon Action Program, and that's a think tank of all the jurisdictions who have their own ETS. And now, of course, China is starting with it, but for instance, China, Vietnam, Laos, there are also developing countries looking at this system. What is interesting in the near future? Well, you need two things, of course. You need to have a public administration who is well, capable enough in dealing with a system like this. It's not for the faintly hearted in a way, and it's quite complicated, because what you do is monetizing carbon emission. CO2, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, you can't see it. So it really takes a lot of power in a way to make this system work. So I can imagine for a lot of developing countries, it's also an issue of empowerment and building up your public administration and dealing with it. But once you have this, well, in the near future, you can also thinking about connecting all kinds of ETSs. And for instance, the emission trading system in California is linked with Quebec. It's a state in Canada. So a company in California can buy the allowances of power supply in Canada. Well, wouldn't it be great in the near future when, for instance, well, we can buy allowances from developing countries and creating a business case for them for reducing carbon emissions. But it's complicated, and we have seen in the last future, and that's part of the COP. If you don't trust one another, and we had situations where some countries did this. Well, we're saying, well, we built this dam project, or we planted these trees, and now we have so much allowances. If it's a bit of a fake and fraudulent or not trustworthy, well, the whole system breaks down. So, for instance, on the COP in Glasgow, there have been some, it's not very well known, but Article 6 is one of the most important parts of this agreement. And how do we deal with monetizing, with monitoring, with interchanging of allowances? So maybe in the near future, could be a business case for developing countries. Yeah, why not?
Are there any questions online?
Yes, quite a lot actually.
Quite a lot.
So the first one is, does the rising price of the ETS allowance negatively impact EU countries with a lower GDP?
Well, that depends, of course. You also could imagine that when you have a lower GDP, that I don't have proof for this, but you can go either way. Suppose I'm this power station in Bulgaria and I have these amounts of allowances and I'm at the early tracks of my abatement curve. Then lowering my emissions could be more cheaper than lowering the emissions of my competitors in other European countries. Therefore, for Bulgaria, it could create more of a business case in lowering your emissions, selling your allowances. And in that case, it could spark innovation within companies in with a lower GDP. So it's not about a GDP. It's about, well, where is your innovation stand, and what kind of growth curve can you make happen?
It's a list, isn't it? So let's proceed.
Yeah, I mean, just let me know when I should stop. The next one is a little bit big. So this is an incentive for the companies to reduce emissions. However, what if the companies have some new projects to gradually become more sustainable? And this cap, wait, what? Doesn't this policy result in the opposite of the desired outcome if they still cause emissions in absolute measures, but relatively less than?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. When those are companies within the European realm, there's no problem, of course, because, of course, for instance, when there's this very new, super innovative factory is producing more, then they need allowances. The cap is still the same. So I hope I understand this question correctly, but it can be the case that, for instance, suppose there's a company in Netherlands who is really growing, then they have more emissions, even when the emissions are more efficient in a way, and they produce more goods for somewhat more carbon, but not that much more carbon as the growth of their goods. But still then they need the allowances from other companies in Europe. So in the end, it's all about the cap, and the cap stays the same. What is interesting for us is, suppose Tesla is thinking about, wow, we're here in California, well, I'm not feeling too good here. I'm going with my factory or my steel factory to Europe. Then we import emissions from one continent to the other. And therefore we have a small amount of allowances on, well, in our stack to give to those companies to have Europe still a breeding place for new businesses.
Shall we do one more?
Sure. So last question from online. To what extent do you think the CBAM is able to prevent carbon leakage, the main objective of the CBAM?
We don't know yet, of course, because there are a lot of questions still to be answered. What I hope and what I think that even the fact that we think about a CBAM helps maybe other continents in saying, well, then we can proceed with an ETS too, because they're not sure whether the CBAM will work. But even, well, it's a way. I was thinking about, maybe it's the wrong metaphor, mutual destruction, what we had in the Cold War. But being able to say, if other continents won't have this ETS and carbon pricing too, then we will regulate you and then we will price you. I think that has an influence in the market. Will it be enough? Well, we'll see. I'm not sure yet. Will be complicated, but I think it's a good thing. It's a good signal.
One final question from
Building on
offline,
the same
please.
question on CBAM actually, because the question came from the student that we were.
Okay,
referring to,
yes.
I think. And one of the things that we were thinking is the primary goal of CBAM, the deterrence that you were referring to, or is it really meant as a policy instrument that should regulate?
Yeah.
It keeps
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe a bit of both. Maybe a bit of both. I think, of course, it will be deterrent, but I suppose that some countries we talked about, for instance, developing countries, won't have the same speed in delivering carbon pricing. So I can imagine that in the near future you will have some, you'll need some way of compensating our carbon tax with the imported goods from other continents. So it's not only a deterrent, but also a way of compensating. To be honest, it's not my invention, the CBAM. I think about a lot of topics, and we are very well involved in a lot of legislative processes. But I was not at the table where people thought about the CBAM, so I can't look in their heads. An interesting question.
I have to apologize to the online people asking great questions, but remain unanswered. Can we ask you to answer the questions, or maybe some later?
No problem.
Yeah,
Yes.
let's do so.
Yeah, I don't know how complicated those questions are.
Well,
so maybe I should.
If you won't get an answer, it might be too complicated.
Okay. Well, on those terms, I will agree.
I have to double apologize because I'm still going to ask you one question. That's of course at the cost of one question online. That is, you're a regulation and enforcement body.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen on your website that, and of course, for these bodies, it is important to have good knowledge.
Yes.
To have knowledge to do your job well. And that actually is the fundament of your position as a regulator. What kind of knowledge? Is it economic knowledge about pricing, or is it technical knowledge? And what kind of knowledge would you want to develop in the future?
Yeah, good question. True. As a regulator, you have to be trustworthy, and you have to be an authority. And the only way of being an authority is having good knowledge, because that's why all the business we price, they must have the confidence that all their competitors will have the same amount of pricing. They will have the same treatment. There's a level playing field. So knowledge is very important. What we have now is people who know chemical engineers. They can evaluate, monitor plants and see, well, does this company measure and monitor the emissions in a good way? So technical skills. We have legal people, because sometimes we have to make a sanction towards companies. We also have accountants, for instance, in the field of renewable energy. It's all about mass balance. It's all about how does flows of trade and flows of biodiesel go. So we need a lot of accountants or forensic accountants. And I think the knowledge we are lacking is data analysis. We are convinced that there's a lot of data. We gather a lot of data, and data-driven policy making, it's a big buzzword. And sometimes I think, well, stop with this terrible word, because we all think, well, what exactly is it? But for us, we really are convinced that more knowledge of what's happening in the market, what are trends, how can data help us in making us a better oversight body, in making decisions where to go and where not to go. That's one of the fields of knowledge we are lacking, and we're trying to be strong in it. But also then it's very connected with the actual knowledge we have. So Well, it's the combination of know the market, know your data. That's what we need.
Maybe there will be a moment that you're going to love this data analysis, even the word.
That's why I'm here, of course. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your nice story. Well, we have an exciting, innovative, in fact, and really flexible system you described here well, and we discussed a lot of aspects about it, the politics around it, also the economic behavior around it, even a bit on methods, on executability or the categorizing stuff.
Yeah.
So we're just having a nice new adventure also with this system, and well, there are a lot of methods, including data analysis, that could help you in that journey. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, too.
So that was the first webinar of this season. I'd like to thank Marcel for arranging it, Alexandra and Rachel as well, Florian and Nels for technical support. Next month, December 15, we'll have a next webinar with Henk Fischer. He's from the Urban Energy Institute. So, well, let's see each other about a month.
Great. See you.